So I started to find out, I had time to analyze. Okay, I've been doing some exercises as well up in my beloved mountains here. I started, along with Robert, something called the INRI Initiative, which is a research organization to try to focus on the possibility of the correlation of EMF, 4G, 5G to diseases and all-cause mortality. I don't need to go into much of that now, but along with that research, I kind of aligned myself with the work of Robert, where he had found very early on that there was the Louis Pasteur germ theory versus the Antoine Bécham's pleomoric theory, meaning, let's say, the theory of those two opposing ideas. And I went into that by analyzing also the history of what happened way back. And I found that all this story about viruses seems to not add up, because it goes back to the 1890s with postulates of Robert Koch of Germany, where he had a gold standard for identifying and isolating, let's say, and to culture microorganisms. And it appears that nobody's doing that. So nobody's really able or verifying the claim of viruses. And this aligned with Rudolf Steiner, who claimed there was no Spanish flu, it was something else. Okay. This goes into also the Freud stories, and this theory of Freudianism is connected to, let's say, psychology of suffering. People had a lot of mental suffering starting in the 1850s. And what I found out that the backdrop of what happened in the 1850s and 1890s was the introduction of the telegraph and the telephone, and later the electrification. And the first global virus came in 1889-90 at the introduction of the electricity. And the second huge one, we all know the Spanish flu, seems to be have been caused by two different causes. One is the incredible, huge experimentation by Rockefeller of up to 23 different vaccination experimental, along with the AM radio introduction. Later, we had the microwave radar, which came about 1957, which then coincided with the Asian flu, which killed millions. We had the Hong Kong flu in 1968, killing millions, at the time of the launch of 23 of 24 huge US military satellites. In Scandinavia, or Sweden, Norway, we launched the 3G 2-3 years earlier than on the continent, and we got a strong flu registered in hospitals. However, that came 2003, 2004 in Europe and elsewhere, coinciding with the SARS-1. And we had the swine flu, which happened at the time of the launch of the 4G. And we have the 4G plus, which includes 3 to 5 antennas used in your phone simultaneously. And we also have, let's say, the 5G, which the virus claim is coinciding in time of the launch of 10,000 5G antennas in Wuhan. And DARPA, which you referred to, if you find the documents of what I have found, you will see that they were really concerned about the research in Wuhan, but the research was not for a virus, it was for the vaccine for the virus. So this is, let's say, it seems to me that the Wuhan is key of research, maybe along with the US places and Ukraine, but the subject matter was to develop bioweapon vaccines. I'm 95% sure. We had strange kind of death in other places of the earth, which coincided with the 5G Starlink launch. And we have the HARP, and we have the Globus 2 and 3 up in north of Norway, which killed a lot of kitty hawks this summer. So this is not me, this is done by others. So there is a massive correlation of events, but nobody had really done a research into the mortality of this. And nobody had seen that there is a different mortality in rural part of a country. And nobody had seen that Switzerland and Poland, for example, operate with a EMF of 100 part of EU. Let's say Switzerland has 0.1 watt per square meter. EU has 10 watt per square meter. So this is, let's say, there's a technology. It gets wider, meaning that they use many different frequencies at the same time. They use different technologies at the same time. They add it up, and it goes from low bandwidth to high bandwidth, to low speed to high speed, low, let's say, electricity to huge electricity, low radiation to very high radiation. So these are the facts of it. But what is really interesting is my studies where I was finding these differences in mortality in rural versus metro. And I wanted to find out what the hell is that. And I found other, let's say, people who find the biological research where they can say that these EMF have a huge possibility to cause what you said, Pascal, about the oxidation problems, your blood, your hemoglobin, let's say, low oxygen, weak. It might be caused by radiation damage to your red blood cells, and I don't want to claim it, but I say it might. Okay, so what I really found, I would show just some slides where you can see, for example, Bergen, where I studied for 4 years. This is all age group. They have a 25% excess mortality during the launch of 5G, while the control group of 43 smaller municipalities with equal or higher population had 0 excess mortality, and they do not have 5G. If you go to the, let's say, 80 plus age group, during the COVID period, you will find that Bergen has 25% excess mortality, while those who lived rural, who would be exposed to the same virus, had 0 excess mortality during or before the launch of the jabs, but also during the launch of the jabs, they ended up with 0 excess mortality, meaning that it seems to be that the jabs alone may not be as harmful as the combination of jabs plus the radiation from 4G, 5G, meaning that if there can be, for example, graphene oxide in the jabs, which are radiated by EMF, which then causes the harm. Okay. We don't need to go into all of this, but let's say this was Norway, and I would like to just touch some other jurisdiction. I can do New York City or USA. So here you can see that New York City, this is the age group 75 to 84. They have a more than 80% excess mortality during the COVID period, and most of it was prior to the jabs in 2020. So, and it is 0 basically excess mortality in 6 rural US states in the same age group. And the main difference is the lack of launch of 5G in rural USA. Of course, jabs have an impact, but it seems they have the biggest impact in combination with the radiation from it. Here you can see the most vulnerable age group, 85 plus. It's a huge excess mortality in New York City and a very low one in the rural 6 states. And the most interesting one might be is the 85 plus, where you compare New York State, in New York Upstate and New York City. The yellow one shows basically 0 excess mortality in the 3-year period, 2020-22, while New York City has 50%. And most of that seems to have happened during the early days, 2020, which may not have been only the 5G, but could also be the hospital protocols, what we know about. However, when you go to Switzerland, you find there is basically 0 excess mortality in the young ages, while it is a very high one in New York City. And if you go to higher age groups, you will see that there is some excess mortality as early as 2020. The highest one in Switzerland is actually in 2020 before the launch of the jabs. But they launched something else. Here you can see they launched in week 12, 13, 14, 15 in 2020. This is Ofcom or DTEC of Switzerland. So they have launched 5G, and we see excess mortality in the weeks during the launch. So this is, let's say, and during this analysis, I found what the heck, there is something going on earlier, and this is in 2015 in age group 45 to 64. We see there is a spike in mortality, and I see that this was happening during the launch of 4G LTE. They went from, let's say, 4G to LTE advanced, faster technologies, more use, more speed. Here you can see Canada, and this is 2020 before the jabs. You can see that it's the same pattern like in Switzerland, but it's a huge increase in mortality during the spring. And this is again prior to the jabs. This is 2020. But you see a huge difference mortality in the rural versus the metro. The metro is, let's say, the bigger provinces. Quebec, Manitoba is small. But when I see each of the provinces, I can see there is a huge difference of specific ones, and those rural ones, they get it later. And when I analyze to see who was launching what when of the mobile operators, I find that there is a direct correlation with the week or month of the launch. So when Rogers launched the 5G network in March 2020, we see what happens in those provinces. And again, this is before the jabs. So this is, let's say, something which is quite interesting. And when I move on to USA, to California, specific, I made 50 counties analysis. A heck of a job. I can show you here, this is during the 4G early period, where you see that it was launched in 2010-11, and there is a spike in mortality. And if you see that those who are living in the rural California in these early days, they have zero increased mortality, and those who live in the big population centers, counties, they have about 15% during 2014, but it is accumulated. So when you see the accumulated totals, you will see that it is 70% accumulated excess mortality in the big counties of California in the early days of the early 4G LTE with one antenna, versus close to zero increased mortality in these rural, smaller places. And I've been living in California, so I know Robert know the same story. If you live in a hill away from the area, you don't have fast internet still, because there is not a socialistic story like in Europe, Norway, many countries. The state are regulating the operators. They need to put out the same level everywhere. In California, it is market driven. So if there is not enough people, they don't put big antennas. In Norway, they will put big antennas in the cities and smaller, different types of antennas with longer reach in the rural. Okay. This is just the early days of California. If I see what happened when later they launched 2 or 3 antennas, which is 2-3 times faster by 3 antennas, but also they went up with the, let's say, frequencies, so they could have a higher bandwidth. So you can see again that those rural counties, they have no excess mortality, while those with the higher population centers have a massive increase in mortality. But there is a time delay, so that the smaller rural counties, they get more later. So it appears that the time delay is caused by, let's say, you put the biggest antennas in the biggest population centers first. So this is, let's say, the younger age group, 24-64. This is the higher age group, 75-84. And if you see here, the 85 plus, they had zero or close to zero excess mortality, while those who are in the rural places in this age group, they have a much, much higher increase in mortality. And I think there are 2, let's say, roads to kill people with radiation. You have those who live close to the antennas. They are at high risk. And then you have those who may not live too far away, but okay, they have high usage. So you can have high usage on your own as one person, or you can be many people in a car or in a bus or in a house. And the accumulated radiation goes with the number of people. So that is why the Swiss authorities choose a very strict regulation. They base their regulation based on the idea that 10 people would be together, and they need to have low or strict regulations, because the damage for 10 people together needs to be taken care of. And then it was 0.1 watt, and it was 1 watt in EU, and then EU increased it to 10 watt, the norm, what they allow. In Canada, it is 4.3 watt, and it is much lower excess mortality. Those with the highest legal, let's say, radiation measured by watt per square meter, with the highest population centers who have antennas close to big housing areas, they have the biggest risk. Finally, I'll just show you something where you can see what happened during COVID. in California, and you see again that the rural population have close to zero excess mortality or low, or less than a half or a third of those who live in big places. Yes. I think that's enough on that, but I just want to compare this with my latest study, which I'm not finished with, but which is New Zealand, because that's some people have made specific claims about New Zealand. So what is the situation in New Zealand? It's very similar to what I saw in California, in Great Britain. You can see there is basically no excess mortality until 2010 during the 3G technology, with up to 5, 10, 15, 20 megahertz of bandwidth, with about 2 megabit per second. While as you increase the speed, the bandwidth in newer technologies and higher frequencies, which allows for much bigger bandwidth, more transport data, we can see that there is a massive increase in mortality following the increase of the radiation. And this is what we see here is that if you see line number 15, that is the 2020 in New Zealand, which had a 13.7% higher mortality than the average baseline from 2006 to 2010. This is all ages. But you see a big jump in 21 and 22. So, and I would say logically, the increase based on earlier analysis very likely is a combination of both the jab and the increase of the radiation. And let's say the explanation is that the radiation, high radiation, when you have taken the third or fourth jab and your graphene oxide in your body is sufficiently high, and you have high radiation of 4G, 5G, you are at big risk of having then these so-called spike protein, which is rests of proteins or cells, dying cells, who have this spike protein outside the cells, or they just rests of dead cells. And these are possible unreported reasons why you find spike protein in those people who have been exposed to both the jabs with graphene oxide and higher radiation. So I will not go too far, but I see a massive increase, and I saw in Norway that this increase did not happen for those people who lived rural, who did not have 5G or 4G plus, and the same I saw in California. And so there is most likely a combination effect where those who get enough micro, call it, it is not just this graphene oxide. The recent research has shown that even these so-called innocent plastics, LNP, they have now been analyzed to find very high, they are charged very high. So it means that they can have a big minus effect, and then you have the plus, let's say, so you can be exposed to this partly also from the LNP as well as the graphene oxide. So this is just an initial story for Switzerland. I have more on the go, but let's say there is an untold story about the radiation, and this has been the main focus of my cooperation with Robert and others. So, and I'm not finished, but this is, and his recent research of finding graphene nanobots, etc., and the damage of these, let's say, they find that this damage is not mainly from the first shot, it is coming from accumulated amount of graphene oxide, but I think also it may be the accumulated increase of radiation by higher and higher, more and more bandwidth, and that might be what you are exposed to by the distance to the antennas, and also how much you use and how many megabit or gigabit you allow for radiation close to you. And I was myself quite damaged in the winter. I was working at a place with 5G, and I didn't realize what it was. And I started to test myself by turning it off and going out and being not exposed and working offline. And after 2 weeks, I was fine. So this is something, and there are some scientists, Lennart, there is a Swedish guy, there are Canadians, and there's Californian. It's very few people who seems to have seen this. And let's say here we are coming into two kind of bombs in the science, because one is that a lot of people believe there is a virus, and this virus seems to me to not exist. It is radiation by electromagnetic frequencies and radiation damage. And the second is, let's say, the jabs and the content and the damage, and what is the how it is going together. Okay. So this was my story, and I'm willing to take any questions, but let's say I'm not finished. I'm working, it's a work in process, but let's say I believe I found something. It is a big challenge to get it out because most people don't accept this. But what you should know, Astrid, is that it's the same regulators. This is also WHO, which allows for these high radiations, and they are having NGOs under them who is, let's say, married to the big telecom companies. So all of this is as corrupt as big pharma. And this is a big elephant, Pascal. I don't say that jabs are not big, but there are two elephants. And very little has been done with this one here. And it is, and people have a very low level of awareness of this. And it might be that your diagnosis and a lot of others who thought they had a damage from something, it might be that this so-called oxidative stress, this can be explained by Robert, but let's say the level of damage to your blood, to your oxygen, to your body can be to a big extent explained by